They didn't know in 1940 if Britain was going to win the war, let alone what kind of political party would emerge at the end of it. Indeed, Attlee was convinced himself in 1945 that Labour were going to lose. The Conservative Party cannot look to the past for answers to what to do next. We are in such a radically different country to that which existed in 1945 that the solutions that Woolton and Churchill and Macmillan and Butler put in place will not, that party, that Britain is dead.
Welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you all for coming this evening. I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the IEA. This evening, we are going to be discussing this book, Blue Jerusalem, which is a rare thing in that it is a scholarly, well-researched book published by Oxford University Press, which is also incredibly readable, incredibly engaging, and important to anyone who is interested in British politics in the mid-20th century and beyond. This is a book about the surprisingly dynamic and idealistic aspects of the British Right during World War II and their visions for a new Britain after the war. This is, of course, the context in which Friedrich Hayek wrote his famous Road to Serfdom, and also the milieu out of which the Institute of Economic Affairs, where we are today, emerged, although it would take until 1955 for Anthony Fisher to piece together the money to set it up. To discuss this book, I'm delighted to be joined by its author, Dr. Kit Kowol. Kit has a DPhil, which he got from Oxford in 2014. He's been an academic, a researcher, and has taught at the universities of Teesside, Oxford, and King's College London, where he is still a research fellow. And he now lives and works in Brisbane, Australia. So, Kit, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Daniel. This is an enormous pleasure for me on two fronts. First, because some of the characters that I write about in the book and the organisations that they belong to meet or lead to the creation of the IEA, and writing about the kind of British right kind of fringe, although it doesn't feel necessarily so fringe any longer, was one of the first of my academic pursuits. But it's more especially wonderful to be here because I actually taught Daniel at Christchurch. So I am fully prepared to be on the receiving end after perhaps dishing out some the roles have been reversed. Complimentary comments on essays over the years. So
I'm definitely going to bring up the Othwork.
Please don't. No, don't get my homework.
So, okay, in terms of the first question is, why the title? Why Blue Jerusalem? What's that about?
Well, I mean, really, it comes from my abiding love of all things punning and cunning, for those, I'm sure you know that Labour during the Second World War, and particularly in their famous 1945 manifesto, talk about building a new Jerusalem in Britain. This kind of glimmering city on a hill, a moral and kind of political exemplar to the world, wrapped as it is in kind of religious iconography. And the Blue Jerusalem element is, well, I'm partly talking kind of blue as in conservatism. So this is the conservative alternative to that that new Jerusalem that Labour promise. But also, I suppose, in a kind of little bit of a touching on the kind of sense of depression and loss that Conservatives feel after Labour win in 1945, about a world that they believe they built during the Second World War that has been suddenly robbed from them.
Yeah. So in the introduction of this book, you sort of set out that you wrote it in part to address certain myths about British politics during the Second World War, and particularly this idea that basically after 1939, or certainly by 1940, the Conservative Party and the British right in general has become discredited, certainly in domestic politics, and that basically you have the Conservatives who are concentrating on fighting the war and foreign policy, and it's really the Labour Party that is running domestic policy, and they're the only ones with ideas about sort of how to run a state. Why do you think this is a myth?
Well, I think it's important to talk about first kind of where it comes from. And as you know, historians like to, obviously, for very obvious reasons, kind of explain how we got to where we are. And because 1945, the Labour victory at the end of the war happens, the story then for political historians becomes explaining why that's the case. The most famous book on British politics during the Second World War is an excellent book written in the 1960s and early 70s by a guy called Paul Addison, called The Road to 1945. And in many ways, that has been, that kind of metaphor of a road was something that I took issue with. The idea that kind of almost a straight line from 1939, 1940, always to 1945. And I really wanted to show, the turnings, the dead ends, the kind of alternative destinations that could have, Britain could have arrived at, and to really highlight that contingency that was a vital part of wartime life. Because, of course, we may know that Labour was going to win the 45 general election, but no one did at the time. You know, they didn't know in 1940 if Britain was going to win the war, let alone what kind of political party would emerge at the end of it. Indeed, Attlee was convinced himself in 1945 that Labour were going to lose. Yeah. So I've always been fascinated in kind of following, those dead ends, those what ifs, those what could have beens.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned this idea that it was not obvious that Britain was going to win the war. And of course, it's the Conservative Party and the British right more broadly has its own ideas about how the war ought to be fought. Could you sort of outline how the sort of differences in approach to how Britain should be executing World War II?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that also kind of comes back to what you were saying earlier about this kind of maybe myths is a little bit too strong, but a particularly structured way in which we think about the war, and this idea that the Labour Party was running the home front and therefore politics, whereas the Tories were running foreign policy and the military and therefore kind of not politics. And I kind of really wanted to get away with that and to kind of bring back the very important debates that were going on at the time, which was that a recognition across the political spectrum, not least from the left, that the way that you were going to fight the war would fundamentally shape the type of society you had during the conflict and also after it. So I'm sure you've all heard of this phrase, the Second World War as a people's war. It's a very popular phrase. I was in Waterstones the other day, and I think actually just now, and I picked out 3 or 4 books that have the title kind of unproblematically in there, The People's War. Now, during the Second World War, most often when the word People's War was used, it was used as a critique from the left to say the war was not being fought as a people's war, that the people were not involved enough. And this was an argument very much associated with people like George Orwell, people like Tom Wintringham, these 2 men who both fought in the Spanish Civil War, who wanted a revolutionary war. They felt that the kind of the brass-hatted, red-tabbed generals, professional soldiers had let the country down. see what happens to the BEF, and that the future of fighting was in arming the proletariat in Britain.
Yeah.
Getting rid of the ranks and structures and arcane traditions and fighting like
militias.
Fighting like militias. Exactly. And they wanted that. And they wanted that at home, and they wanted something similar in the empire as well.
Yeah. So this is where the book 100 Million Allies If We Want Them comes in, where the idea is that you sort of try and inspire anti-colonial revolts in...
Yes. All across Far East Asia, you arm the peasantry of India and of Africa, and they'll all rise up. Now, of course, conservatives are deeply concerned about this because they know who those guns may very well be turned on after they're kind of done defeating the Germans or the Japanese. Likewise, they're aware that if you fight a war of the armed proletariat, where the power and the prestige will come afterwards. And they're also very sensibly aware that this kind of fighting would be, I think, a disaster.
Yeah. And did any of the sort of voices on the left reflect that this sort of militia-based war hadn't worked out very well in Spain?
Well, there was a degree of reflection was not always particularly common on that side of the aisle, but it would be a disaster militarily and therefore sociologically. Tories were very aware at the time that Britain, of all of the major combatants, had the smallest population, and they'd been through the First World War. They'd seen the enormous social upheavals that had come alongside the loss of millions of young men's lives. And they believed, I think predicted quite rightly, that if that was going to happen again, you'd have another social revolution in Britain. So instead, they wanted to fight, and indeed Britain did end up fighting, more of a war of the professionals, a conservative war, a consciously anti-revolutionary struggle, rather than the people's war that Orwell and the like were in favour of.
And this is where we get the idea of the British Army prioritising steel over flesh in the Second World War, in that you sort of throw as much equipment as you can and you don't sort of attack until you have a really overwhelming advantage.
Yeah, you don't sacrifice lives unnecessarily.
Yeah.
I've never quite understood why so many people valorize the Soviet Union during the Second World War, because a lot of Russians died fighting it. That's having a lot of your population die in order to win is not necessarily a good mark of success, to my mind. Yeah. And I think, Tories during the war were rightly cognizant of that.
Yeah. And there's also this idea of liberal militarism, which is a sort of grand strategic approach to fighting wars. Could you outline what that meant to the British right during World War II?
Well, they would probably have kind of used the idea of kind of the British way of warfare, really. And this is what Britain had always, fighting the war the way that Britain had fought wars previously, particularly prior to the First World War, with its enormous continental commitment, which we might get onto, that a number of conservatives were very sceptical of afterwards. But instead to fight a war based around using the power of the Royal Navy, blockading the enemy, denying them food and fuel, etc., and using that, and using your finance to support others who actually did the nasty business of continental fighting.
Yeah. It's a form of economic war that brings your sort of financial supremacy and your dominance of the seas to kind of...
Which was the advantage that Britain had. It never would have the same kind of scale of population of the Soviet Union, but it did have the technical and especially the financial ability to wage that kind of war of machines and of ships.
Yeah. And obviously this type of approach that focuses on maintaining control of the seas, not having major European commitments, this elevates the importance of empire as well, doesn't it?
Very much so.
Yeah. Is that, do you think, a self-conscious attempt from imperialists inside the Conservative Party who are trying to sort of elevate the importance of empire, or is it not directly linked?
Well, I mean, in some ways, I think it's hard to talk about a Conservative Party in the 1940s that wasn't imperialist. I mean, that the empire was like ran through the party like a stick of rock. There are different ways in which people wanted the empire to develop and had different ideas about, the best form of imperial development or how to support it. But, whether that's kind of protection or free trade, etc. But they were almost all imperialist to a man. And the idea that the British Empire would be gone in a matter of decades would be almost unthinkable to them. Yet at the same time, they were deeply worried about it. At the same time, they realized an enormous conflict would destabilize the empire and diminish those important resources that Britain had, which is why so many Conservatives before the war were supporters of appeasement.
And also, interestingly, during the war, one of the chapters in this book is almost entirely dedicated to Lord Beaverbrook, who is a newspaper proprietor, a Conservative minister, but who is also becomes almost fanatically sort of aligned with the Soviet Union and sort of is coming out with suggestions that, Britain needs to send several divisions to the Eastern Front. How does that, where does this sort of alliance come from?
Yeah, I found it fascinating. It was surprising for me to see it. And I think one of so Lord Beaverbrook, who's this Canadian newspaper magnate, mogul, great friend of Churchill, inveterate political schemer. I'm not sure if we're streaming this, but there's some fantastically rude remarks about him in various diaries that I probably can't quote. The nicest one is that someone would say, I can't tell if Beaverbrook is more like Puck or the devil. Right. Another one said, I didn't believe, I never understood people's desire to label another as a shit until I met Lord Beaverbrook. And yes, he's an inveterate political schemer, and he, bizarrely for a multimillionaire newspaperman, becomes the great kind of hero of the Soviet Union during, particularly 1941, 1942. And this is always, well, not always, but largely put down to him, jockeying, manoeuvring, trying to potentially, displace Churchill. But actually, digging into his thought and ideas, which actually go quite a long way back about his relationships with Russia. What it really seemed to me to, and kind of demonstrated by his writings at the time, was that he had a very realist approach to international relations, we might call it.
Yeah. And he's suspicious, particularly of the United States.
Absolutely. I mean, his view is that we shouldn't judge other countries based on their internal politics. He hated communism, and he liked capitalism. But he recognized that America was probably a greater threat to the British Empire commercially in the long run than the Soviet Union. And therefore, what Britain needed to do was balance against America by becoming a bit closer to the Soviets. And he's a great advocate for this during the war.
Yeah. How much of the sort of, and he's not alone in being quite suspicious of the United States. How much is this an outgrowth of conservative protectionist trade policy and their desire to sort of maintain imperial preference?
Well, I mean, it's a big part. I mean, in many ways, Beaverbrook says it himself about America, that he wants the type of tariff system that America had, that he saw kind of led to its industrial greatness, wants that for Britain. And he doesn't see it being very fair for the Americans to have had it. And then at a moment of British weakness during the Second World War, try and rip away the limited protection that Britain had built up in the 1930s and which he'd like to see developed over over the war and into the future. And it also, I suppose this is the thing, and we do tend to forget this in the world of contemporary conservatism, which tends to be kind of a rather Americaphilic, that there was a long strain of anti-Americanism within the Conservative Party, and particularly a dislike of this rather hypocritical nature of American comments about the British Empire, the loathing of the British Empire, while at the same time Americans had the Philippines, and perhaps didn't treat some of their own native population in entirely the most liberal fashion. So it's this real visceral, emotional belief, partly coming from a place of recognition of a kind of a desire, a kindred connection. You should be supporting us as a kind of a fellow Anglo-Saxon nation. Yet at this moment of peril, you're putting your kind of boot on the neck.
And yet, of course, we've got through all of this so far, I think, without actually mentioning the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who is very much an American-phile.
Yeah.
In part, his mother is American. But is this also a product of him being originally more of a free trader, in that he's less suspicious of American attempts to deconstruct British protection?
Yes, construct an American Lebensraum, as Leo Amory, the Indian colonial secretary, describes America's free trade policy. Yes, you're absolutely right. He doesn't have the same visceral, emotional connection to free trade as some of his, most, in fact, of his Tory compatriots. And of course, during the Second World War, free trade has a kind of wonderful kind of renaissance moment, particularly in the early part of the war. Kind of forget that the first kind of Franco-British free trade moment actually happens in 1939, when all duties and tariffs are taken off between the two countries. And this is seen as perhaps the start of a wider, European free trade area.
Yeah.
As your pal Hayek, who you were mentioning, talks in 1939 about a global free trade order, and perhaps a return to the kind of Cobden-esque arguments about the Pacific nature of free trade, the way that it breaks down barriers of amity instead of cooperation, how it leads to economic independence. And these are arguments that, I think Churchill's quite susceptible to.
Yeah, I really want to get onto that, actually. One of the most interesting sections in the book is on the chapter, the longest chapter, in fact, which is on food. It is, why did you decide to spend about a fifth of the book dealing with the food supply, and what role does trade play in this?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Partly, and I'm afraid those of you who are going to be diving through the book trying to find Tory alternatives to the welfare state and the Beveridge report will be somewhat disappointed, because I spend a lot more time talking about food. Partly this was because this was something that Tories at the time themselves spent a lot of time talking about. There's a great quote in the book that talks about, yes, we can talk about Beveridge once we've got something to eat. And it was a real concern in British policymaking during the Second World War about where Britain would get its food from, because Britain was a country before the war that imported a very large proportion of its food. I think it was the second, after Norway. God, you read me, much. After Norway, it imported a higher percentage of its calories than anywhere else. And the basis of for having the kind of economy that would support that food system, the overseas investment, the invisible exports, that had been in many ways destroyed or given away during the war. So there was a real sense of how was Britain going to, not so much, how is Britain going to create an economy that would allow it to have enough to eat?
Yeah.
And would it have an economy that was oriented around production from food at home, of a more autark economy? Would it have an imperial economy, drawing food from the empire? Or would it have a free trading economy, picking up, in many ways kind of going back to a kind of food system? So it wasn't just about food, it was about the type of economy that would support a particular food system.
Yeah. Well, particularly, I suppose, because food expenditure accounts for about a third of all household spending during the 1940s. So it's roughly equivalent to how much people spend on housing today, as opposed to food. And you
only a third.
Oh, well,
lucky.
Depends where. But I think the average household today spends less than 10% of their income on food. So food is just a much bigger part of consumption, a big part of the economy. And the war cannot be fought if you do not have the supply. And you bring up the example of this group called the Individualists,
yes,
who think that the best way to sort of sustain Britain is actually not through more state planning, not through protection, not through an imperial system, but through a return to 19th century style free trade. Can you get?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is this organization, the Society for Individual Freedom, which is where Anthony Fisher and Oliver Smedley actually meet. They hold a number of wartime austerity luncheons, which I have to say don't sound particularly appetizing. But, maybe they shared a glass or two at those. And yes, they are, I mean, in many ways, what we might think of as like a libertarian organization, led by a chap called Ernest Benn, who was...
or uncle of the Tony Benn?
Yeah, I think uncle.
But a much better Ben overall.
Well,
the best Ben.
Well,
that's the IEA official position on Ben.
We'll say and yes, I mean he's one of those people who really kind of give speak truth to the idea that zealots make the best converts, because he's a socialist during the First World War. He even spends a lot of time with the Webbs and becomes a great fan of government planning until, like me, actually ends up working in government and becomes rather frustrated with the world of bureaucracy, and instead becomes probably the Britain's most important interwar promoter of individualism and capitalism. He produces a book called Confessions of a Capitalist that sells hundreds of thousands of copies. And his is a very familiar kind of mid-Victorian self-help, Samuel Smiles, Cobden and Bright, Gladstonian finance type of politics.
And one of the points that these sorts of people make is that actually, so it's often seen as a vulnerability of Britain during World War II, that it's importing most of its food. It has a very small agricultural sector by comparison to almost anywhere else in Europe or the world. But that actually means that unlike Germany, where 30% of the labour force is in agriculture, in Britain you have a much smaller sector. It's about 5% of the workforce, which means you're able to have more people in the armed forces, more people in industry. And if you have a relatively efficient manufacturing, you're able to buy food from abroad, which actually one of the most interesting statistics from the book is that throughout the war, 56% of calories that are consumed are imported. So actually, in many ways, this seems to be an advantage that Britain has over Nazi Germany, which is pursuing a more sort of autarkic approach to agriculture.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the kind of the pattern. This probably is a myth of the Second World War, that Britain becomes self-sufficient in food. In no way does it become self-sufficient in food. It changes the type of food that it grows. It moves from importing a lot of very heavy and bulky materials, which obviously take up a huge amount of shipping space. You need shipping space to move munitions and material around, to instead importing lots of calorie-rich items. So that's your Fray Bentos and your tinned ham and things like that.
So rather than animal feed.
And then raising them in your at home.
Yeah. Okay. As we're talking about food and land, I do want to touch very slightly on planning and on land use, because in many ways it's one of the most persistent legacies of the post-war Labour government is to introduce the Town and Country Planning Act and nationalise development rights. What are kind of Tory attitudes to how land should be used, and how do they differ from the Labour Party?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those areas where there is some overlap, and there are these curious alliances. So you do have people on the left, again, George Orwell brings back these kind of romantic socialists who have their dreams of people with, 5 acres and a cow and the kind of small yeoman farmers and back to the land. And there are Tories who very much agree with that.
The ruralists,
as I call them. Many of them involved on the fringes of fascist organisations, and then who go on to start the Soil Association. So think about that the next time you get your organic sourdough bread. And then you have other Tories who are kind of hyper modernists and believe in chemical spraying and mechanization of the land, which kind of feeds into, has similar kind of echoes on the left of the kind of celebration of Soviet collective farming. I suppose the key difference in that area is that although there are most Tories at the time, with the exception of the Individualists, are okay with a degree of planning. But the question is always who plans and in whose interests. So during the Second World War, one of the ways in which agricultural land use was planned was through things called emergency war agricultural committees. And these were groups of, a bureaucratic group of farmers that would tell your landowners in a particular region what they'd be growing in this field and how they'd be operating. And a lot of Tories were quite in favour of it, because it turned out that the people who were running the war agricultural committees were the local aristocrats. So they were quite happy with this, and they actually saw this state intervention as a way of maintaining pre-existing social relationships. Whereas others on the left, obviously, that was an anathema.
Yeah, you also see this in industry to a certain extent, where there's sort of paternalist industrialists, people like the director of Ford in Britain, who are okay with a certain amount of planning, but they want to be very sure it is businessmen who are doing it rather than trade unions.
And absolutely, and that also follows on wartime practices. So you have export and import groups during the war. You have groups. The state organizes industry in order, particularly export industries, which have to be deliberately kind of narrowed down to focus on production of war material. So they have to kind of winnow out firms. They have to rationalize, to use the language of the day. But who is it doing this rationalization? Who is deciding which are the efficient factories which should continue and which should not? Those are industrialists themselves, and they want to continue this during the war. And I suppose that's one of the kind of the big arguments of the book, like with the example of war agricultural committees, is that there's as much kind of war conservatism as there is war socialism during the conflict.
But the emphasis of many historians and people looking back at it has been to focus on the conservatism because we are on the socialism because we know what happened in the 1945 election. On the topic, actually, of the 1945 election, obviously, throughout Churchill's time in power, there has been a coalition between the Labour Party, the Liberals, and the Conservative Party. But the Conservative Party on its own still has a pretty substantial majority throughout the war. So I suppose the question is, why does Labour leaving the coalition after victory in Europe Day force an election? Couldn't Churchill have just carried on just with Tory and Liberal support until victory in Japan?
I mean, it's a good question, and I think some people probably would have wanted to do that. I think it would have been very hard to do so. There was a degree of legitimacy, well, a considerable degree of legitimacy that came from having the Labour Party as part of the coalition. And Churchill certainly does want to carry on until certainly after the war in Japan is finished. There are some conservatives that talk about the fact that, maybe, what we could do is we could have a referendum rather than an election. Let's have a referendum on whether or not Churchill should continue as leader and the wartime coalition should continue. And if that loses, okay, we'll have parliamentary elections. But if not, we'll just carry on. I mean, there are so many, the things that we take for granted about the way that elections work in Britain, the nature of the constitution, even the very country that we are. Of course, there's the plan in 1940 for an Anglo-French union, a uniting of the two countries, shared citizenship with us and the French, the horror. All of these things could have been very, very different.
Yeah. And even actually one of the things I wasn't aware of until I read your book was that Clement Attlee himself was actually quite open to the idea of continuing the coalition until victory in Japan, which at the time, because they weren't aware of how far the Manhattan Project had progressed, that could well have been another 2 years away. Why did the Labour Party end up deciding to leave this coalition and force an election?
Well, it was an internal party dispute. Basically, Herbert Morrison, the future Labour Home Secretary, actually they were Home Secretary during the war, he is manoeuvring against Attlee at the time. There's something in that family that involves manoeuvring politically against other Labour Party members and leaders. And he kind of stitches it up while Attlee's away with the NEC to not have an election. Attlee is, you have to remember so much with, as we've said, we have the benefit of knowing what happens afterwards. The way in which so many people during the war were thinking about the future was by looking backwards at the past. And what they remembered was the incredible victory of Lloyd George in 1918 in the khaki election. And they saw the possibility, Labour and Tories, of a repeat. So there was a fear that Labour might do really badly in 1945, and therefore staying in coalition was a kind of wise political move.
Yeah, but we know they didn't do really badly. They had their first majority ever in a general election. So why did the 1945 election go so badly wrong?
For the Tories.
Yeah.
Well, I think the main reason for me is there's a very powerful narrative that Tories had run about the Labour Party in the 1920s and the 1930s, was that the Labour Party was not patriotic. And you simply cannot make that argument in 1945 when you have been serving alongside the Labour Party in office. Indeed, this is one of the things that makes Winston Churchill's famous Gestapo speech go down so poorly. The idea that the Labour Party, if they get into office, might have to institute some form of Gestapo.
No doubt very humane in the first instance, he says.
As Churchill said, because it just didn't ring true. So that is one of the key reasons. I suppose the other is memories of the interwar period and the enormous unemployment that affected a large portion of the country. The sense that Labour's very convincing argument at the time that national action and national planning, look what we were able to achieve during the war through through state intervention, let us do in peace what we were able to achieve in war.
Yeah, although one of the, it didn't ultimately work, but one of the interesting things that you mention about the Tory campaign is they were quite keen to emphasize the idea that, private industry had played a big role in developing the technology that had won the war. So, for example, the Spitfire was developed by a private company, and they hammer that.
They hammer that home. They also hammer it home, and the extent to which there was a pretty advanced welfare system in Britain before the Second World War.
Yeah.
One that was admittedly directed towards the most needy, and specifically directed towards the working class. But the pre-war years were not this kind of purely miserable Jarrow March, failing dockyards, hunger strikes and general strikes image that the Labour Party painted.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really fly.
Yeah, and obviously in the late 1930s, you have a big boom in a lot of the economy in the southeast of the country, and there's a massive expansion in housing construction. Does that just not really have much impact after the war? Is the idea that the world has changed too much to sort of return to a late 1930s vision of the British?
Yeah, and I wish you'd been in charge of Tory party strategy in 1945 rather than Ralph Assheton, because that's an excellent argument to emphasise the number of homes that had been built during the interwar period. Unfortunately, they didn't do that, and there wasn't necessarily a huge upswell of support for socialism in Britain in 1945, but there was a belief that the country was going to be facing some pretty enormous challenges, particularly around housing. And there was the sense that the Labour Party was more committed to fixing this than the Conservatives.
Yeah. Okay, a final question from me before we move to the floor. Had the Conservative Party won in 1945, what would Britain have ended up looking like? Would we have just sort of been frozen in the 1930s? Would we have looked more like a wetter version of Australia?
Yeah.
What would have been the differences, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question, and of course we don't know. There was huge amount of contingency in the period. We had the development of the Cold War that could have things could have got quite hot quite quickly in that period around the Berlin airlift. I suspect that we wouldn't have had the extent of nationalisation. I suspect that the welfare system that had been created would have been based much more on Tory plans during the war, which would have involved much more of an insurance element, although there was an important insurance element within the Beveridge report. But there would have been much more focus on local and voluntary hospitals and a plethora of different providers. I suspect that the relationship with America might have been a bit more fraught actually.
Right.
The Washington loan that Britain has to sign up to was deeply unpopular within the Conservative Party. And I can see a situation, because there were kind of strings attached to it that involved dismantling either immediately or soon after various elements that propped up Britain's imperial economy and its particularly its imperial monetary system. And that there would have been Conservatives who remained wedded to the empire and saw it as a real going concern and a way to balance against the superpowers, who would have been much more sceptical about signing up to that. I think Churchill would have had a very hard time pushing that through.
Yeah. And what about the NHS?
Well, what about
that?
Do we get the NHS? I think we get something like the NHS. I think you might get something like the, as you mentioned, the system in Australia, where there is state funding of hospitals, but they are provided by private providers. You know, I live in between the Catholic hospital and the Wesleyan hospital, and you could very much imagine a similar situation rather than one massive state bureaucracy operating.
Yeah, which nationalizes a lot of these charity and local hospitals.
I mean, and that's of course one of the great stories of the Labour government, is that it's a very nationalist government. It's the National Health Service, it's British Rail. They build a much more nationalist manufacturing-centred economy than perhaps the Conservatives would have done.
Okay, great. So we have a bit of time for questions from the floor. There is a roving microphone. So the gentleman at the front here first, in the orangish shirt.
Thank you. Michael Savage. I was interested, you talked about Lord Beaverbrook as a realist, which is certainly true. But I think at the time, realism in the UK was being defined from the left with people like E.H. Carr, Professor of Printing House Square. And it wasn't really developed from a more conservative perspective until later, and from the US, drawing on sort of Central Europeans, Schmidt and that kind of tradition. I'm just it really intrigued by that, because for all that the Conservative Party was focused on the war and international affairs, there was a real gap in thinking and theorizing and policy making about international affairs from the right, with the complex exception of the English school. I'm just wondering why you think that might be.
Well, first off, you're right. If Daniel had used the word realism in 1940s in a tutorial, he would have had this was horribly anachronistic from me. But that's the way it goes. Why was there not more theoretical thinking about international relations during the Second World War is a great question. I'm afraid I don't know the answer. There's an awful lot of thinking about international organization at the time. There's practical thinking about what to do with Germany. Ideas about breaking up Germany. There is a sense, I think, amongst large sections of the party, particularly the grassroots, that all of this thinking abstractly about international relations during the interwar period is what led us to the League of Nations and the failure of international order in the 1930s, and that we should not be obsessed with abstractions. And this is what the left does, and we're practical and common sense, and we'll just focus on the maintenance of power and influence. And it's long been a conservative kind of rhetorical tactic to say that we don't do ideology. The left does it. Of course they do, and I suppose that was what I was trying to get out. But you're right, there is a bit of a lacuna in that sphere, and delving into that question would be fascinating.
Okay, any more questions? The gentleman here at the front right, just wait for the microphone, please, and say your name, if that's all right.
John Strafford. What role did party organisation play in the 1945 defeat? Because I put to you that the Tory party was pretty well defunct. Its membership was down to about 250,000. It had hardly any constituency agents because they'd joined the services. It had run out of money. They weren't doing anything. After Lord Walton came in as party chairman, to compare, by 51 we got a membership was 3.1 million. And on the other hand, the Labour Party depended very much on its organisation and its activists for the trade unions, which was still strongly in existence. So did that lack of organisation play a big role in the defeat?
So it was certainly that was an argument that could have come straight out of a Tory Party journal in 1945, that said that it was all down to our patriotism. Why were our agents not on the ground? Because they were fighting in Italy and France and Burma. Now, of course, there were, however, advantages. There was a reason why the Tory party organisation was run down at the time, particularly in 1939, 1940, and that was to deliberately appear patriotic. To make the case that the Tories were putting country before party, unlike the Labour Party. It took until 1942 with Tommy Dugdale to try and get the wheels in motion, and I'm sure it did have an impact on the election around the margins. It certainly led them to have very poor political intelligence. That's why many in the Conservative Party thought that they would do very well, perhaps even better, they had done in 1935. But it is balanced against that fact that it contributed to the argument that the Labour Party was for itself, whereas the Tory Party was for the country. And I think, at least for some people, that had a payoff. It's always very difficult to figure out exactly what was the issue. But it was a very useful argument after the war, because it allowed the party to avoid the kind of internecine political warfare and that often emerges after after political defeats. So whether or not it contributes to the defeat, it certainly contributes to the victory in 1951.
And also weren't the Conservative Party quite keen in 1945 to de-emphasise the existence of the Conservative Party and emphasise, Winston Churchill himself as a semi-presidential candidate? Yeah. They technically don't even have a manifesto. It's just Mr. Churchill's declaration.
Mr. Churchill's declaration to the electors in which the word conservative is not used anyway, and they run as a national government.
Yeah. Okay. Any more? Can we take these two together and then we will call it a day? So, gentleman on the right first.
Yes, thank you very much. In terms of two, I'll keep them short points. Firstly, before the Second World War, the left had been organising their ILP summer schools, Fabian summer schools, and left book clubs and so forth. The right hadn't really done much intellectual heavy lifting. I got the impression in the build-up to the war. During the war, there is the Commonwealth Party, which is running as effectively a Labour proxy with people like J.B. Priestley publicising it, and the Picture Post, which is a mass publication, which is very socialist. I don't see that coming from the Conservative point of view. So that's just a question. Where were the classical liberal / conservative alternatives to this? Because it seems that they had a machine that wasn't possessed on the other side. The second point, which I was going to put to you, is after 1945, it seems that everything is, we mustn't be free market. We have to go along. We have to establish this consensus. It got to the stage where Brendan Bracken was effectively the only free marketeer left in the shadow cabinet at one point. And when people like Edward Martell cross over, rather like Ella's J.P. Benn comes from the Liberals, it's been a good Liberal organiser. He's put in the same category throughout the 60s as the League of Empire Loyalists. And all he is basically a libertarian. Oh. So it does strike me that there is this period after 45 where it's do not mention the free market, do not go down that path. The public will never support us. Do you think there's any validity in that interpretation?
let's just take that first. So, where were the classical liberals in the pre-war period, and why does free market?
So there's a really wonderful book by a fantastic scholar called Clarice Betherzine, which is all about Ashridge and the Conservative battle for ideas. Ashridge was the Tory party's training college, and she makes an argument that there was quite a important conservative attempt to create a kind of supportive intellectual environment for conservatism through organizations like the Right Book Club and the Conservative Book Club, through Ashridge itself, through organizations like the Ashridge Circles, through the development and support of a particular type of middle brow literature. Again, not necessarily, there was a fair number of publications that were about big C conservatism, but also a lot of support for publications about the history of the Constitution, of the Empire, of the nature of England, which were supportive of perhaps of a conservative mindset. So that very much did exist during the 1930s. I think one of the reasons I argue that there was a bit of a conservative intellectual renaissance during the Second World War is that is because of this lack of central party control. It becomes a kind of bottom-up thing that happens. There are journals, pamphlets. I started writing this book because I went to the Bodleian Library and I just kept on finding them. Loads and loads of these things out there. And because there wasn't one, because there wasn't Churchill had to keep different kind of factions at bay and was trying to rise above conservatism or the Conservative Party. There was this fight on for the future of conservatism and for the future of Britain. And it does lead people who perhaps been marginalised in the 1930s when a particular kind of middle of the way Baldwinian conservatism dominated to kind of re-energize themselves. So there's a kind of a world of luncheons and dining clubs and kind of proto-think tanks out there listed in the book. And the second part of the question, which was about
the decline of sort of people identifying with free marketeers sort of after World War II.
Yes, that's great, and I'm so glad I look forward to talking about Edward Martell later, who was oh, did you? I wrote my master's thesis about him, so we must chat. So, where does it go? Well, I think there is a sense in the party, and orthodoxy emerges afterwards the Second World War, that what lost it was a failure to embrace the welfare state and to embrace economic planning. And that form of explanation overtakes the form of explanation that it's all about organization and actually sometimes go together. We need to plan the organization, we need to plan the economy. And that does really become solidified within the party.
Okay, and time for a final question. The gentleman at the back here.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the talk. My name is David Bradley. My question is, how will the Conservative Party evolve from here on, bearing in mind that it has similar problems and issues? It's a very broad church, and some would say it's the uni party. Some would say that the majority of its MPs, or a large proportion of the MPs, should actually be Liberal Democrats. So how do you think the Conservative Party will evolve here going forward?
I will let Kit take that question, but I should probably point out the IEA is a non-party political think tank. And we are very happy to, when you write the sequel to this on the Labour Party in World War II, or the Liberals, or the Beaverbrook Centre Party, we will be very happy to talk to you about that as well.
Well, there's a reason why I moved from political science to history. I was much better at talking about what happened in the past than predicting what will happen in the future. So that's my kind of glib answer to it. But I suppose what I will say is that, and this is going to be terribly bad for the sales of the book. It's really good that my publicist isn't here. The Conservative Party cannot look to the past for, which it has always done to try and recover from elections, for answers to what to do next. We are in such a radically different country to that which existed in 1945, that the solutions that Woolton and Churchill and Macmillan and Butler put in place will not, that party, that Britain is dead. In many ways, we're in a completely different situation and completely different Britain to the Britain of 1997, the last time that the Tories were turfed out in such spectacular fashion. In 1997, 71% of the population described themselves as Christian. 91% of the population was white British. This is it's not a long time ago, but it's a very, very different world. The Conservative Party it'll absolutely need to, I think it can learn from the past. It can learn from the fact that, if you want to have, big, bold, it has had big, bold ideas in the past, that those ideas come from not limiting yourself to just looking at what's going on in America and having a bigger set of thoughts about an understanding of Europe. But it has to be really, really careful of trying to draw parallels from what came before.
Okay, with that warning, which will surely crater your book sales, so a very heroic thing to say. Thank you for joining us. This has been really interesting. I have a few final announcements, so thank you all for coming. But other than that, I think we just need to give Kit a round of applause.
What's this?